Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. My name is Jeremy, and I'm a representative of EHN Canada. We are a nationwide network of treatment centers for addiction, trauma, and mental health. We have facilities located in Nanaimo, British Columbia, Calgary, Alberta, Toronto and Peterborough, Ontario, Montreal, Quebec, and Annapolis County, Nova Scotia. We offer high-quality inpatient, outpatient, and online treatment programs. For more information, please visit our website at ehncanada.com. Just in terms of a little housekeeping, everyone is on mute and cameras are off for today's webinar. But please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our speaker. We will try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out a follow-up email next week that will include the link to the video, the slides, and any useful resources, as well as your CEU certificate. Again, we will be sending out a follow-up email next week that will include the link to the video, the slides, and any useful resources, as well as your CEU certificate. I am currently in Toronto at our Bellwood facility. Toronto is located on the traditional territory of several nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples. It is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. We also have presence in today's webinar located at our Edgewood facility in Nanaimo, British Columbia. They are on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional territory of the Sununamuk First Nation. Vancouver is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. If you are new to this work and want to find out whose land you are on or grew up on, please check out native-land.ca. Many more of you may be physically present elsewhere, and I encourage everyone to use the chat function to, where applicable, share whose land you are on. Now, to get to today's session, sex and love addiction. We have Mike Juarez, and he has been committed to the field of mental health and addictions for over 15 years, helping individuals, families, and couples heal from addiction, trauma, and attachment issues. He brings his own personal experience and knowledge and passion into his work, using his expertise in a number of treatment modalities, including emotionally focused therapy, somatic experience, mindfulness therapy, accelerated resolution therapy, and internal family systems therapy. Mike's credentials include master's level clinician, certified sex addiction therapist, and certified Canadian addiction counselor. In the community, Mike educates students at Vancouver Island University on topics related to process addictions and support families and organizations in safe sport through Gymnastics Canada and Gymnastics BC. Mike is currently a clinical counselor and clinical lead of the sex addiction treatment stream at Edgewood Treatment Centre in Nanaimo, British Columbia. Please help me welcome Mike.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Jeremy, for the wonderful introduction. And depending on where you're at, either good morning or good afternoon. As Jeremy stated, I'm over, excuse me, on the West Coast here, so it's morning for my time. And again, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating and engaging in this. As far as an agenda, there are quite a bit of slides here. And so, as Jeremy acknowledged, the bulk of this presentation is going to be on sex and love addiction. And really, in a sense, one thing that I do want to acknowledge right off the get-go is that, I see love addiction as part of sex addiction. And so part of what I'd like to relay as far as information today is in a sense, how you're going to see symptoms of love addiction show up in some of the types of sex addiction that I'm going to initially identify. So if we really look at kind of a table of contents as to what this presentation is going to look like today, I want to spend about 15, 20 minutes, at least as my goal, to really, in a sense, break down the 10 types or elements of sex addiction. I'd like to then give you, another 15, 20 minutes of the best conceptualization of love addiction that I can. And I think more importantly, I will continually go back as I talk about love addiction as to how it shows up in the 10 symptoms or 10 types as far as symptomatically that we reviewed initially. And lastly, I want to spend about 10 minutes or so tops to really kind of talk about the treatment options. As Jeremy acknowledged, I am the clinical lead here at Edgewood in Nanaimo, which is a residential treatment setting. And we do have and have had for about 4 years now a specific program, a recovery zone task model based program that has been developed by Dr. Carnes and colleagues, Dr. Patrick Carnes, through the International Institute for Trauma and Addictions Professionals, a 42-day residential program that specifically treats sex addiction. And I do often get clients that fit symptoms of love addiction. And oftentimes, actually, they don't know that they fit those symptoms. They acknowledge and come in with perhaps knowing or a previous diagnosis of sex addiction from their referral therapist. But it's only until they get into the treatment process that they recognize that there are symptoms of love addiction present. So I want to talk a little bit about what the treatments options are and how we treat that here at our facility. So let's begin with this first part of 3 parts where I'm going to break down the 10 types of sex addiction. And so I'm going to try to kind of give you a general overview of these 10 types. There is a lot of information as these have been statistically analyzed. I want to tell you a little bit about where this comes from. Dr. Carnes initially wrote a book called Don't Call It Love. And in that, really, in a sense, research was done around statistically analyzing and breaking down types of sex addiction. And so really, in a sense, these are the 10 types that really kind of formulated out of that research. And so these are the components that I'm looking for when I'm really kind of looking at components of sex addiction. Here are the 10 types broken down. And so again, what I'm going to do is just to, have a look at each one of these. And I think the important piece to look at here is as we're going through these 10 types, I really want to point out where the arousal stems from in each of these types. As you can see, they're very different. And so really, in a sense, when we're talking about sex addiction and hyperarousal and really looking at an addiction model, neurobiologically, we're looking at where we have that spike of dopamine, oxytocin, or vasopressin, which is present as addiction chemicals in many of these behaviors. But more importantly, as the addict is engaging in the behavior, taking them to that hyperaroused state, what is tied into that arousal? And so that's going to be made up in these types. So let's talk initially about this concept of fantasy sex. And so I want you to remember the term fantasy in the sense that when we go to the second part of this, where the focus is on love addiction, this concept of fantasy is going to come up quite a bit. And so I do want to acknowledge that of the 10 types, fantasy sex is definitely symptomatically present in love addiction. And so fantasy sex is really sexually charged fantasies, relationships, and situations. And so when I'm looking at love addiction under the umbrella of sex addiction, I do find that much of the motivation behind what's driving the love addict to do what he or she is doing is rooted in fantasy and how they have an emotional charge, whether it's sexually charged or emotional charges to fantasies, relationships, and situations. And I'm going to talk a bit more about in the love addiction component where that comes from. Here, the arousal depends on sexual possibility. And for many sex addicts, they find refuge in fantasy sex because other forms of acting out are simply too complicated, they're too risky, or they require too much effort. And for the sex addict or love addict who's engaging in fantasy sex, there is safety in staying in the fantasy world as opposed to acting on the fantasy or even going into reality, because there is safety in that. Fantasy sex can flourish when there's no reality testing, and really, in a sense, the safety is represented in the individual's fear of rejection, fear of reality, and the reduction of their anxiety. And so really, in a sense, they stay in the fantasy to manage the anxiety that they often feel in reality relationships. The second type I want to talk about is voyeurism or voyeuristic sex, where it's specifically tied to visual arousal. And it's the use of visual stimulation to escape it into an obsessive trance, right? An escape, if you will. And we see as an addiction model, many people talk about whether it's substance abuse or sexually acting out, that it's a means to escape. And oftentimes to escape from reality, and which really is kind of the cornerstone of the last type we talked about from a fantasy perspective. I think voyeurs are, non-participants in the sex game. They move beyond fantasy to searching out sexual objects in the real world. Or many of them are tied to a porn addiction. And so where much of porn exposure is about visual arousal and stimulation. And so they escape into an obsessive trance through the world of pornography. Third type is exhibitionistic sex. We see this as one's need and desire to attract attention to themselves, to their body, or sexual parts of their body. I often see this tied to performance in the sense that it's about drawing attention and the need to have attention directed your way. Here, sexual arousal stems from the reaction that the viewer has, whether it's shock or interest. It's really all about being seen and the hyper-aroused state around being seen. In a sense, we can put it this way, that exhibitionism is the whole "I will show you mine" part. And when it is obsessive and compulsive, it is a significant distortion of normal courtship because the focus very much so is on the attraction. And again, soliciting attention from the viewer, whether shock or interest. We often see that this can be present in the love addict in the sense that exhibitionistic behaviors are present in the way to seduce the partner. And so they will engage in these behaviors to capture the attention of the lover, per se, that they are projecting their fantasy onto. The next type of sex addiction is seductive role sex, where really, in a sense, the arousal is based on conquest, right? So it's the conquest or the process of seducing the future partner, and so this high, per se, from the conquest rapidly diminishes after initial contact or after the kind of honeymoon phase of the relationship. Where oftentimes the love addict is in that hyper-aroused state, right? Where again, they're feeling those love chemicals, the dopamine, the oxytocin, the vasopressin. And so for sex addicts, specifically love addicts who engage in the seductive role sex, they often have had a disrupted attachment style that in their early childhood, whether it came from parents that were disengaged or from their primary caregiver that had a disrupted attachment style themselves, where they felt close but then pushed away. And so they're used to kind of highly conflictual relationships. And so oftentimes they will get high in the seducing or winning the attention, exhibitionistically, or basically bringing the conquest process of their future partner towards them. And they're really, in a sense, hooked in falling in love and winning the attention of the other. This often gives them that sense of worth, that sense of value, that sense of lovability that often is questioned or not present in the individual that we see systematically in many love addicts. The next type is paying for sex. It's often that we don't see many love addicts engage in this process unless or when the current relationship they're in and the addiction chemicals have subsided or there's been withdrawal from that relationship. And so they see that process as a chemical withdrawal. And so in order to manage the withdrawal, they engage in an addiction interaction disorder per se, where they will then perhaps engage in a sex addiction-like type of paying for sex commercially, where really, in a sense, this is purchasing of sexual services. And so the arousal in this sense is more or less connected to the payment for sex. And with time, the arousal becomes connected to the money itself. Really, this is about power. Compulsive prostitution is a larger problem in this issue, and it does reflect relationship failure. But really, in a sense, what we're looking at here when it involves paying for sex commercially is really, in a sense, arousal is connected to that money transaction because it's a power position, really. And so this allows for the locus of control or power, or for one to gain their power back, which is, been lost in the previous relationship or love addiction relationship per se. The next type is trading sex. Selling or bartering sex for power. Again, power is another component within this transaction, and the arousal is based on gaining control of others by using sex as leverage. Again, much about control, so we will see seductive role sex involved in this process, and in a sense, the conquest, part of the conquest is gaining control. And so we will see oftentimes, because the love addict will require sex as assurance, right? To assure them to manage their anxiety and to use sex to self-regulate, providing them with assurance that the relationship is intact and there's love within the relationship. They will often trade sex or use sex as leverage, as a way to gain control. Really, in a sense, that control allows them to emotionally regulate or lessen their anxiety. I want to kind of point out, as I'm using terminology of emotional regulation or anxiety, that many sex addicts or love addicts in particular are highly anxious in close relationships, right? And so really, in a sense, they mistaken love as, in a sense, rather than a freed up process, as healthy love is, it's very distressing for them. And they go through a very distressful process because they have such a need to feel loved, that unfortunately, pathologically, they'll exhibit behaviors to provide them with assurance that that need is being fulfilled. The next type I want to talk about is intrusive sex, where this is a significant boundary violation without discovery. This particular type is oftentimes hard to see. The sexual arousal occurs by violating boundaries with no repercussions. Now, I'm happy to see in this day and age that there are many individuals that are coming forward now. And so we're seeing more repercussions and consequences for individuals who are engaging in intrusive sex, as it should be. But years back, we weren't seeing many people come forward for various reasons. And so individuals were able to engage in this type of sex addiction with no repercussion or consequence. Individuals who engage in this intrusive sex-like behavior, such as touching people in crowds or making obscene calls, are really perverting the touching and foreplay dimensions of the courtship process. And in a lot of cases, they're using others for sexual arousal with little chance of being caught. And so we will often find love addicts engage in this process as well, as they intrusively engage in some of the seducing-like behaviors that have them lure the potential relationship towards them. Another type that we see is anonymous sex, where really, in a sense, this is high-risk sex with unknown persons. I want to say, here the arousal involves no seduction or cost, and more importantly, it's immediate, it's instant gratification. We see this fairly prevalent in the utilization of adult friend finder type apps that are out there, where people really, in a sense, completely go from the noticing, or perhaps even a distorted version of the noticing initial stage of the courtship process right to intercourse. And in a sense, the idea is really, in a sense, for sexual gratification. And so apps such as Tinder, probably, which is the most popular one, are utilized in these scenarios, really in a sense to acquire a connection physically, to engage in a sexual act, and to, in a sense, really never see each other again and repeat this process. Having to experience fear in order for arousal or sexual initiation to work fundamentally distorts the courtship process. And so there can be some fear in anonymous sex, because really, in a sense, you don't know who this person is. You don't know perhaps what they're bringing, whether it's a sexually transmitted infection or whatever it may be. And so, the safety of enduring bonds is never there to allow for any sort of deeper, profound risks of being known by another. Really, in a sense, there is no intimacy required in this process. And so often part of the fantasy sex component that I first talked about as well, where really, in a sense, there's no risk of vulnerability, no risk of intimacy. And so really, in a sense, that is the purpose of this process. Many people kind of acknowledge, well, what's the harm in this, right? If both parties acknowledge that really, in a sense, the only transaction within this relationship is to be sexually active with one another, and that's all it is, really, in a sense, you're kind of deeper and deeper imprinting this idea of basically engaging in a sexual act that is purely physical. And really, in a sense, exercising this idea of not having to engage in intimacy or vulnerability. So many people who engage in this process really have to work towards abstaining from this process in order to provide any opportunity for any sort of sustaining, intimate, vulnerable relationship. Another type that we come across is pain exchange sex, where oftentimes these individuals require, as part of their arousal, some form of pain. Being humiliated or hurt is part of sexual arousal, or sadistic hurting or degrading another sexually, or both, is part of this process. And so people who are compulsively into pain, degrading or dangerous sexual practices often have significant distortion in their courtship process, or really in their ability to create an attachment. Specifically, touching, foreplay, and intercourse becomes subordinated to some dramatic storyline, highly conflictual, that usually is a reenactment of a childhood abuse experience. Pardon the typo there, that D should be an F. I know it's standing out significantly to me. But here we have, basically past sexual abuse experiences. And the difficult part in that is that as these are highly traumatic experiences, we can't forget that whether desired or not, arousal attached to that experience. And so when we have, pain or fear, danger attached to arousal in a sexual experience, it's those fuse together. And so oftentimes we see individuals who will reenact or re-engage, or will require pain to be part of the sexual process in order to create stimulation and arousal. We see this as a highly dangerous process. And so hence, the importance for treatment in this type of setting, because this can significantly hurt self or others in this process. I want to talk a bit about exploitive sex, exploitation of the vulnerable, where, in a sense, arousal patterns are based on target types of vulnerability. Here, the addict in this category will use grooming or seducing or seductive-like behavior, which is to carefully build the trust of the unsuspected victim. And I think oftentimes when this is in place, this can be an early childhood reenactment, where oftentimes parent or caregiver would engage in kind of an emotional incest process, where they required their emotional needs to be met by the child. And so child can, in a sense, be seduced in that way. And so they have experienced this and will often kind of reenact some of these behaviors in their form, because they see this as closeness or connection or love. Attraction, flirtation, demonstration, romance, and intimacy are all used to gain the confidence of the person for sexual exploitation. And so we will see many love addicts, engage in this behavior exploitively because this is a way in which they groom their prospecting relationship as a way to hook them and get high on hooking them, bringing them closer, using many other types, whether it's exhibitionistic type ways to draw attention to their body. You can see now how many of these types can kind of interlink, and we can see symptoms of numerous ones all within one process. So, that was a lot of information there, just talking about the 10 types of sex addiction. And so I drew a couple of kind of examples to some of the ways in which we see symptoms of love addiction as part of this process. And so I really want to break down this concept of love addiction. What I am so fascinated in the area of love addiction, which happens to be my area of specialization, is in the psychodynamic aspect of looking at attachment disruption, how that's formulated, and really, in a sense, really looking at some of the early childhood relational traumas that one has experienced that has had them rooted a disrupted attachment style. I'll be honest with you, for those of us who are familiar with attachment styles, secure individuals have low anxiety and low avoidance as part of their experiences in close relationships. And many love addicts have high anxiety, and their low avoidance isn't a healthy low avoidance. It is really, in a sense, an enmeshment or a codependency, one would call it, in close relationships. And so that's where their process of loving becomes very distressing for them, because any inactivity in the relationship causes them distress. That's the high anxiety part. And so they will engage in love addiction-like behaviors in order to self-soothe, in order to regulate that anxiety. So that's kind of, in a sense, what I like to identify as the love addict. There's another one that's going to come up in the presentation, referenced as the avoidant addict. And this individual is a love addict as well, but with a different attachment style that is more avoidant, right? And so you're going to see them higher on the avoidant side of things, but also anxious. So they're going to have high anxiety and high avoidance, having them in more of that fearful and avoidant attachment style quadrant. And so I just want to draw attention to that as we're going through this. So, love addiction is a condition in which individuals do not fall in love with someone who will return their affection. Reason being is because oftentimes they have experienced highly conflictual relationships where perhaps they feel the sense of closeness, they see that as love, but there's a pulling away. We see many love addicts come from, or perhaps have had parents, or specifically mothers who have borderline issues. So there's kind of that pulling close, pushing away, that we often will see, in the avoidant addict. So in a sense, rather, they are attracted to somebody who will neglect the relationship. And so, we would look at this as, wow, like why would someone, in a sense, engage in a process where they're falling in love with someone who won't return that affection? Love addicts are not addicted to another person. Often this is a misconception that the unique content of their addiction and the mental obsession is at the other individual. But more importantly, it's to the fantasy of the relationship and how that will affect their lives. So you could look at it this way. The love addict, in a sense, is more or less addicted to, because when they're in the fantasy-like state is when the addiction chemicals are being solicited to the brain. Again, that dopamine, that vasopressin, that oxytocin. And so when they're in the heightened state or hyper-aroused state is when they're in the fantasy-like state. And so when they're projecting that fantasy onto the other person that may look like they're addicted to, in a sense, it's more around the addiction to the fantasy. It's called love addiction because the emotions that are experienced for that individual as love, attachment, connection, he or she gets me, sexual attraction, desire, worthiness at last. And so I really want to kind of draw attention and focus on this concept of that word worthiness. The origins of love addiction are in early childhood trauma, as I see it, caused by neglect or abandonment. These are pretty complex traumas. essentially a failure to attach securely. These individuals have never really had experience in securing attachment due to perhaps the rigid disengaged family systems of which they come from, whether they come from families systems where one or both parents are also in their own addiction process. And so there could also be little micro traumas that come up that disrupt that attachment style. Say, for instance, when parent states or promises that they will pick them up and they don't do that, and parent never really goes to or goes through a repair process with that child, never apologizes, and so then that they become experiencing this highly conflictual attachment within that relationship. The important point to look at here is when a child is feeling neglected, disconnected, disengaged, or lonely, daydreaming and fantasy provide the sense of security, safety, and attachment, which is necessary for a sense of well-being, that in a sense that child matters to someone, even if that someone is not responsive, available, or even real, an idealized figure that makes up of the fantasy. Reminder that fantasy provides the chemical changes to the brain, much like addictive or compulsive behaviors do, as we see. And it targets that pleasure reward circuitry part of the brain. The addiction is to the chemical release in the brain when the child is in that fantasy-like state. So I want to talk a bit more about these two types that really, in a sense, are rooted with the different attachment styles that we see, because I believe, again, that this is rooted in attachment. The love addict, or LA, I like to reference, whose greatest fear is of abandonment with an underlying fear of intimacy or enmeshment. And we see an individual with the other, in a sense, fearful and avoidant attachment style, or what I like to call the avoidant addict, or AA, whose greatest fear is of intimacy or enmeshment with an underlying fear of abandonment. So we can see where some of these components are kind of, in a sense, flipped. And it's helpful to acknowledge that these individuals are in two different attachment quadrants, right? Where the love addict is often in the preoccupied attachment style with more of an enmeshed, even though they have an underlying fear of intimacy or enmeshment or being engulfed, they will often engage in behaviors that represent that in order to regulate their anxiety. And so again, in that top right quadrant of an attachment style, or low avoidant, high anxious, the avoidant addict, who's in more of a high avoidant, high anxious attachment style, fearful and avoidant, will often engage in the avoidant or pushing the other away in that underlying fear of abandonment, but fear of engulfment and so, or enmeshment. So they've been in kind of highly conflictual relationships as children, perhaps with their parent, where there's a lot of that push and pull process that goes along. Behaviors that are assigned to the love addict that typically we see, they assign too much time, energy, attention, much like an obsession and value to the other person, usually at their own expense. They have a loss of self. They cannot see themselves apart from the other. They often come from that preoccupied attachment style and perhaps boundary violation, in the sense that there was an inadequate sense of self that was formulated in early childhood. And so they require the affirmation, the connection, the assurance from the other in order to develop their sense of self. They bond quickly with others. They appear warm and emotionally responsive. But more importantly, they are terrified or they're highly anxious in the inactivity in the relationship, and they want to know what is happening with their partner at all times and see this as love. And so that's the difficult part, is in a sense, they're in a sense trapped by their own process and their own anxiousness to really, in a sense, know where their partner is all the time. Will often engage in obsessive thought processes and behaviors that kind of are driven towards this need to know where that individual is at all times, so that they have a sense of where the relationship is at. Oftentimes they are attracted to the independence and the strength and the challenge of hooking the avoidant addict with their erotic energy, because there's a high in the process of conquest or hooking that other individual, although ironically they're attracted to that independence. So in a sense, they're attracted to someone who's independently able to be separate, although they have anxiety in the separateness of the relationship. So you can see where this can become highly conflictual. Hence, love addicts will engage in highly conflictual relationships. Behaviors of the avoidant addict really, in a sense, because this individual has an excessive fear of engulfment, control, entrapment, and being overwhelmed, oftentimes they'll have a need, or driven by a need, to avoid intimacy to manage their own fear. That's where their anxiety comes from, is within that fear. Both are intrigued but yet repulsed by this love addiction process, where in a sense, typically most individuals have had smothered parents, or even can have underfunctioning parents in this situation. But smothering parents or overfunctioning parents is kind of what I'm referencing here. They oftentimes have confusion in their aloofness for discretion, their willingness to move on for their independence. They often get stuck in this process of attraction to the love addict's warmth and open emotional expression as they appear warm. And so that's really, in a sense, where they become hooked, because a love addict is hooking them in that kind of form of seduction. And oftentimes it's done in an exploitive way. And so these are the complications that the avoidant addict feels in this process. Here are some of the very triggering processes that happen in these highly conflictual, very dramatic relationships that I will acknowledge, where, in a sense, sometimes the addiction in the fantasy is drawn to the highly conflictual, dramatic type scenes that play out, or scripts that play out within the fantasy. We see, with both, whether it's an underlying or present fear of abandonment, because many of these individuals have experienced significant abandonment and neglect as trauma in their early childhood relationships. Abandonment bombs, which really, in a sense, are projected towards threats of ending the relationship, are like trauma wounds within them. And so anytime in these highly conflictual relationships, the abandonment bomb is thrown out there in these highly conflictual settings, they're having a trauma reaction or trauma response. Oftentimes, even these abandonment bombs could be indirect, in the sense that they look like stonewalling within the relationship, where when the love addict is having the experience of being stonewalled by their partner, they go through shock, they go through a traumatic response. Dr. Sue Johnson often refers that to leaving the dance floor, which really leaves that individual into a very vulnerable spot, where again, their nervous system becomes flooded, much like the trauma experience. They're in a significant place of distress, and so will need to act out to, in a sense, manage their selves. And so that's where oftentimes we will see them as the breakdown of the love addiction relationship kind of usually results. We will find love addicts then engaging in another type of sex addiction or substance use, as we see that as co-occurring, in order to manage or regulate themselves, because they can no longer utilize the partner and their fantasy that they have attached to that partner as a means of managing their anxiety. We also see this as rage addiction, or again, acting out in other addictions, comparing the partner to past partners. And oftentimes we'll see kind of a trauma bonding process that happens here, where we see these patterns, systemic patterns of traumatic experiences reenacted in numerous relationships, or even in a form of relationship addiction, where we see this pattern happen, where this person goes from relationship to relationship to relationship over periods of time, where they in a sense formulate this same process, and so further trauma within the bond of the relationship. Blooded distancing or disassociating during or from sexual contact, emotional withdrawal, cultivating resentments within the relationship, which then creates the dramatic storyline, the hyper conflictual processes, cultivating sexual opportunities outside the relationship, so affairs, escorts, porn, and we see those as paying for sex commercially. We see, the affairs can happen in more of a seductive way of soliciting the attention of that individual, whether it's exhibitionistically, porn, or more voyeuristic like sex types. So, as we see, this is the difficulty in really kind of looking at these types of sex addiction, how we can tease out symptoms of love addiction. And I think now that you have kind of seen this presentation and maybe have a better conceptualization of what love addiction is, as we see, very much rooted in attachment style, very much due to more childhood experiences where there was neglect and abandonment happening for various reasons. And so, those children go into that fantasy-like state. And the importance of that is so that they can, in a sense, create a scenario where they're lovable, where they matter, where they're worthwhile, and they're dependent on that. And so when they become of age to project that fantasy onto another person, it now becomes the other person that they're dependent on in order to feel loved, to matter, and to feel worthwhile. As I think about it, I have a significant amount of compassion and empathy for individuals in that place. Anytime when one is questioning one's worth, one's value, whether they're worthy, whether they're lovable, we can see that person in a very distressed place. And so, I want to draw attention to where this is kind of rooted in a core belief perspective, in the sense that, I think Dr. Patrick Carnes has done some amazing work in really kind of teasing out and formulating kind of 4 core beliefs that we often will see in the sex and love addict. One is really, in a sense, no one's going to love me as I am, because I wasn't loved as I was when I was a child. And so, there's the questioning of one's lovability. The other is when that child was in that state, right? Really, in a sense, their emotional needs weren't met. And so they have this core belief that my needs won't be met if I have to rely on others, right? They see that for whatever reason, because of perhaps the reason why I was abandoned or neglected, that I must not be a worthy person, right? Maybe I'm a bad person. And then more importantly, as they see sex as intimacy, which is often formulated in many of the types of sex addiction, where there's that drive to require sex and will engage in pathological-like behaviors in order to be sexual with somebody, we can easily formulate that sex is their most important need, right? Because we all are relational beings, wired to secure attachment and need to feel secure, and this idea that we can depend on others. But when we have sex wrapped up into that process, and we require sex in order to feel that sense of connection, we see it as one of our most important needs, because it then becomes one we have this need to secure attachment. And again, sex is wrapped up in that secure attachment, although we know in a healthy, secure, low anxious, low avoidant attachment style, sex isn't required in that, right? It really isn't. Sex can be a byproduct, or in a sense, one of the beautiful aspects of that intimate relationship, where there's intimacy and vulnerability as part of the process. And that's where we can have synchronous sex happen, healthy sex within relationships. Okay, so let's move beyond and kind of look at some of the treatment options. I want to talk a little bit about what we offer here at Edgewood in Nanaimo within the EHM Health Network. What is offered is a 6-week residential program where in a sense, it's a 42-day task model-based recovery zone program using the recovery zone material and the recovery zone start kit. And I want to talk a little bit about that. Dr. Carnes and Facing the Shadows, which is the workbook that they work through, that are really, in a sense, a set of performables that are represented in the competencies that we're looking for to really, in a sense, have the individuals in the treatment setting fulfill. They also go through what's called a 40-day focus, which uses core dialogues and meditations as part of the process. And so we also have them read the book Out of the Shadows, which is also authored by Dr. Carnes. And so really having them have an understanding of this sex addiction process. We have specialized sex addiction focused groups, including psychoeducational components, coping strategies, and cognitive processing therapy. That task model, task 1 through 7, is really, in a sense, what we work through, accompanied in the Facing the Shadows workbook. They have access to expressive art therapy sessions with our expressive arts therapists, daily mindfulness and meditation and yoga practices, where really, in a sense, we go through daily practice in the morning to really, in a sense, realign the endocrine system and repattern one's nervous system as there's, through the trauma they've experienced, an inability to really, in a sense, emotionally regulate. It's an absence-based programming with applicable contracts that we have in place specific to that individual, specialized addiction-focused groups, really looking at the addiction interaction disorder concepts and how they can have a co-occurring addiction such as substance use and a sex addiction and how they interact and reinforce. Relapse prevention and aftercare planning, significant aftercare planning processes, learning about healthy intimacy and healthy sexuality, exploring core trauma issues and using accelerated resolution therapy, excuse me, as part of that process. Also, individuals who are coming in will be prepared for a disclosure process that perhaps in part of the aftercare planning and post-treatment will have to and will get to go through a professionally guided disclosure process in order to re-engage back into the marriage-like relationship. So in a sense, lots offered within the treatment option as a 42-day, 6-week residential program setting. Edgewood Sexual Addiction Program is specifically designed for men specifically with compulsive sexual behaviors as the area in which I treat. We do also treat females, not so much as a specialized program, but within our kind of core program, where there's a kind of a component for those who have a concurrent sex addiction. And so we also have another therapist on staff that works specifically with women and will have focused groups specific to women who have symptoms of sex addiction. Sex addiction is frequently accompanied by a concurrent substance use disorder. And so our program really allows clients to work through concurrent substance use and compulsive sexual behavior separately with the understanding of how they interact together, really in a sense using that addiction interaction disorder theory of oftentimes really exploring that in many cases, the sex addiction is the primary process and that really in a sense part of the ritualistic process is the engagement in a substance use disorder in order to kind of whether in a sense manage or flick the switch for the sexually acting out compulsive behavior. So I'm going to end there. I'm kind of proud of myself in the sense that I was able to kind of stick to the time frame because I do want to kind of leave opportunity for some questions as this is kind of can be a very confusing process. And so there's as I can see numerous questions and so I'm grateful for Jeremy who's going to kind of stick handle those and help me to kind of answer some of the more pertinent questions that are out there.
Of course, yeah, thank you so much, Mike. Like you said, lots of questions, which means lots of interest in the topic and lots of information. So thank you so much for that. And we will get into the questions for sure. So you briefly did talk about our Edgewood specific program. Can you kind of give a little bit more insight to the process for admission?
Yeah, so typically what happens is, many individuals may have a referral that is also a CSAT that is familiar with some of our assessment tools, whether it's a sexual dependency inventory or even just a SAST screening tool that is a series of 20 questions. And so there's clinical thresholds that allow us to kind of really see whether there's sex addiction present. And we use these kind of assessment tools for perhaps individuals to then go through the admission process where they can call in, really in a sense, speak to an admissions coordinator around maybe questions they might have. But I think more importantly, providing us with some of those materials so that we can kind of really acknowledge the suitability for the programming and in a sense then allow for the enrollment process to happen for treatment. So oftentimes there will be collaboration with other CSATs, other referents, other mental health and addiction practitioners that really are able to see signs of sex addiction to make sure that that's suitable. And I think more importantly, to note that this is a concurrent program, so we do treat the chemical dependency process as well, kind of as a hybrid with our already kind of core addiction treatment process that we have here at Edgewood.
Thank you so much. And then in terms of fantasy sex, is fantasy sex connected to increased self-stimulation, or is it exclusive to thought and fantasy?
That's a really good question. I mean, it is very much in the mental powers. So imagination, memory, and intellect per se. And I think when it can stay in that place of the thought process, and when it furthers into obsession and then accompanied by a compulsive behavior, in often cases chronic masturbation, we can see where that in a sense is an unhealthy sex with self process due to the consequences, whether they be medical intersection or physical consequences or relational consequences. And so we see individuals in those patterns solely dependent on that process so that they don't have to engage in a reality-like setting. And so when we see individuals in that process, wired for addiction, and we often will see then, a kind of an addiction interaction disorder process in this, where there's the use of a stimulant, cocaine, crystal meth, various other addictive substances. The individual ends up in a process, an interaction that becomes fairly problematic, and so where that fantasy flourishes into that process, we can see where there is where it opens the doors for compulsive behavior and addiction.
Great, yeah, thank you. Can you explain the difference between sex addiction and healthy fetishes?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. The thing that I like the wording in that question, healthy fetishes, because I don't want to, and I think we have to be really careful in looking at paraphilic or fetish-like behavior sexually and not right away stamp pathology onto it or acknowledging that it's unhealthy. Because fetishes are really, in a sense, part of one's arousal template. And so, our arousal templates are like a map sexually. And so there are various things based on our experiences that arouse us. I think when there's, chronic, engagement in a fantasy sex-like behavior or voyeuristic sex-like behavior like pornography, we can engage into some pretty unhealthy blueprints to our arousal over time as there's gradual desensitization, right? And so we require greater intensity, greater risk, as I acknowledge in that pain exchange sex, to arouse us. And so when that becomes perhaps then part of a fetish, right, it could look like the engagement in high risk, perhaps physically damaging sexual behaviors, where we could maybe perhaps coin that as unhealthy. But I want to be careful in using terminology like unhealthy and healthy to a behavior that can be, highly consensual and talked about and open for individuals to participate in, where there isn't any damage, there isn't any hurt that happens physically, mentally, or emotionally. But I think more importantly, there isn't shame attached to it.
Yes, of course. I think that's very important. So there's been a lot of discourse within the chat box, specifically about the term addict.
Mm-hmm.
So are there any learning in the field from harm reduction communities about the use of the term addict?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad that that's put forth. I think in the context of presentations such as this, addict is terminology used. I myself like to, and the reason why we call our program, compulsive sexual behavior program, really in a sense minus of the word addict or addiction in the title there. We do use kind of a pathologized abstinence-based process, from a neurobiological standpoint, because we know that as we abstain from the addiction process, per se, that gives us the opportunity to, have a reboot of the system per se, neurobiologically, so that we can actually learn to engage in healthy sexual behaviors. And so, one might look at that as, well, then how can you use the term addiction? Because in numerous addictions, we see permanent absence of the behavior. And so really what we're saying is abstinence of the unhealthy behavior or conflictual pattern of relationships. And so the reducing harm could be looked at as the damage control that's utilized to at least have that individual disengage from that process. And so I can see there where, when we use terminology of addict or addiction, the stigma or unhealthy kind of connotations that are attached to that are present.
Definitely. And like many people mentioned within the chat too, it's more of a conversation to have with the individual, because obviously everybody's journey is very personal and specific to them. Certain words could be triggering to them, whatever it may be. So like you mentioned, Mike, it's just important to kind of have that conversation with the patient and to kind of see where their mind is at with terminology. I think that's super important as any healthcare professional.
Absolutely. And I think, addiction, we see it, we pathologize it as an illness. And I think that there are so many ways to act out in an addiction. So the whole kind of umbrella concept of addict or utilization of addiction, I think is representative of so many different behaviors now, specifically in a process type form. And so for me, I really attach it to this concept of arousal, right? And hyper aroused or hypo aroused states, right?
For sure. And then many people mentioned as well too, and I just want to reiterate it, that the patient is so much more than their addiction. Like that's not their defining quality, and that by no means is the intent for sure. That is just they are a person first, and their addiction or illness, whatever it may be, is a part of who they are.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably, in a sense, rooted as one of the larger competencies that we want individuals to acquire when they're in our treatment setting, is to really, in a sense, differentiate themselves from the addiction. And more importantly, seeing themselves as not the addict per se, or they're not their addiction. It's actually much more powerful than them, and to be able to externalize it. And I think that's the beauty of the 40-day focus, utilizing these core dialogues to, in a sense, develop a relationship with, in a sense, your addiction, seeing it not as you, and being able to create dialogue and distance oneself, but yet have this relationship and seeing yourself apart from it, right? And that it's not representative of you.
Of course. We did have a specific question too about the book you mentioned, Don't Call It Love. If you could tell us the author.
Yeah, the author is Dr. Patrick Carnes, who's written various books. The more prevalent one that's used on kind of understanding sex addiction is called Out of the Shadows. But one of the initial books that he wrote, called Don't Call It Love, I kind of just put out there because it was really, in a sense, it came out of the research done where I believe 114 statistically analyzed sexual behaviors were present, which all fit under those 10 types that I categorized. And so much of the material came from that as to how we titled those 10 types as a way for us professionals to really look at the type of sex addiction that we're, in a sense, treating and assessing and conceptualizing.
Of course. Unfortunately, that is our time. We could do just a Q&A as our next webinar because there's so much interest within this topic. But Mike, thank you so much for such an informative and insightful presentation. I think we did a great job of destigmatizing the conversation and really pushing forward that it's just like a part of life that you can move forward with specific treatment options. And like you mentioned throughout, there's so many different variables that add to it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy.
Of course. And thank you so much to everyone for your attendance today. Just a reminder, we will be following up sometime next week with a copy of today's recording, Mike's presentation slides, and then any additional resources that were mentioned throughout today's presentation will be included as well. We look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Take care.